Good evening, everyone. Thanks for being here. My name is Lydia Zeininger. I'm the Executive Director of the Ukrainian Institute of America. Happy New Year. Thanks for coming out on a cold, blustery night. We waited a bit, so our full group is here. We're very excited to have them. A few words first. Some of you know us, some of you are members, and some of you may be here for the first time. So I wanted to let you know about the Institute. Since our founding in 1948, we've been dedicated to celebrating and advancing Ukrainian culture. Through art, music, literature, and much more, we strive to showcase Ukraine's rich heritage and serve as a bridge to become where the world meets Ukraine. As we begin tonight, we ask that you join us for a moment in something we started doing, unfortunately, now quite some time ago, on the first anniversary of the full-scale invasion. Before each of our events, we stand and we take a moment to reflect on the sacrifices that Ukrainians make even now as we're here in our comfortable place in New York. People are willing to sacrifice themselves, and we also pay tribute to those who have already given their all. So if you would join me for a moment of silence. Thank you very much. So we are privileged tonight to welcome three remarkable journalists, Christopher Miller, Simon Shuster, and Sasha Maslov. Tonight, they will share frontline experiences, ethical challenges, and the global impact of their work, highlighting journalism's vital role in preserving truth during crisis. They're quite accomplished, so if you don't mind, I'm just going to read their bios quickly, very briefly, and I hope we hear a lot more about where they came from, how they got to where they are now, and what they're doing. Christopher Miller, chief Ukraine correspondent for the Financial Times and author of The War Came to Us. Reporting from Ukraine since 2010, Christopher has uncovered Russian war crimes and published work in leading outlets, including The Times, The Guardian, and The Atlantic. Simon Shuster, a seasoned correspondent for Time magazine with over 17 years of experience. Simon has extensively covered Ukraine and Russia's authoritarian transformation. He has gained rare access to Volodymyr Zelensky's administration and has reported from the front lines during the Russian invasion. Sasha Maslov, a Ukrainian-American photographer renowned for his environmental portraiture and storytelling. Based between Kyiv and New York, Sasha's work has been exhibited internationally, including here at the Ukrainian Institute in 2017. And he contributes to top publications while pursuing compelling documentary projects. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to our panelists. So in fact, I shouldn't call you panelists. You're conversationalists. We decided among ourselves that you all know each other, and rather than have some extra person joining in, you could have a conversation among yourselves. And we'll do that for a little while. We will enjoy listening, and then we'll move on to a Q&A. And after that, please join us for a reception with some Ukrainian wine and beer and some snacks. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you very much to the Ukrainian Institute and all of you for coming out. It's great to see so many familiar faces and to be here with two very close friends of mine, Simon and Sasha, and also esteemed journalists. We will keep it conversational. We did not prepare too much for this, but we've interviewed a couple of people over the years between the three of us, so hopefully we can keep it going and keep it interesting, and of course save time for your questions at the end. As Lydia said, we will speak about covering a war and what it is like to be on the front line of the largest land war in Europe in 80 years. That war, the front line being Kiev, but also in the east, in the south of the country. But one point that Simon and I actually were discussing just before we began here was that actually the three of us are not war correspondents. We never set out in our careers to cover war. I think if you would have asked us, certainly myself, 20 years ago, even 15 years ago, when I was in Ukraine, but before the war began, if I wanted to be a war reporter, I would have told you that's not what I was after. We're all more subject matter experts, Ukraine experts. And so we'll talk about how we came to be sitting here in front of you talking about a war. To start off, myself, out of the three of us, I am the one who does not have a Ukrainian background. You can tell by the name, Christopher Miller, I'm not Ukrainian. But I was fortunate enough to be sent to Ukraine in 2010, not by my asking, but fortunately by the US Peace Corps, which sent me to Ukraine, and I spent 2 years living and working in the eastern Ukrainian city of Bakhmut before I finished my service, moved to Kiev, and got into foreign correspondence there. My colleagues here, Simon, in Simon, you have a Moscow-born correspondent who has Kiev roots, and Sasha, Kharkiv roots, but has also a background in fine art photography and portraiture.
Yeah, my name also doesn't really give me away so much. Yeah, Sasha Maslov, you can sort of suspect that there's some Eastern European roots, but right. Yeah, I was born in a suburb of Moscow. My family is sort of half Russian, half Ukrainian. My father grew up in Khmelnytsky, and we immigrated to the United States when I was 6 years old. So at birth I was Semyon Shuster. So yeah, easy transition to Simon Schuster, which sort of gave me some cover growing up in San Francisco. But yeah, I moved to San Francisco when I was 6, grew up there, had the language growing up. We spoke Russian at home. And because of the language, when I decided I wanted to be a journalist at some point in college, I decided that. I knew that Russian would be a real competitive advantage. So I moved to Moscow right after university and began reporting, basically interviewing people in Russian and writing about it in English to kind of bridge the deep misunderstandings and between the two cultures. But like you said, not a war correspondent. I mean, I'm not even sure what that means or how you become it. There may be some kind of graduate programs that I'm not aware of that teach you, this is how you put on a vest. And this is how you should behave in the vicinity of explosions and so on. I'm not aware of any such program. I certainly didn't go through one.
I think we've come across some war correspondents who do the bouncing around from conflict to conflict thing, though, in Ukraine, because they've been in Iraq and Afghanistan, Syria.
They got into that. Yeah, but I think all three of us were pulled into war reporting by events, by wars that sort of broke out, and we were asked to cover them. I'll let Sasha speak for himself, but I had not seen much of I'd never seen a tank before. The first time that I saw military in action was in Crimea in end of February 2014.
We met in Crimea, right? At Belbek Air Base during the annexation.
So. We met. I don't know if that was the first time we met, but yeah, we met there when the Russians were occupying. And I remember I was there as the occupation was unfolding, and this was the period that some of you, I'm sure, remember of the little green men, and it wasn't clear what does that mean? They don't have any markings on their uniform. So these are the kinds of things that someone more familiar with military affairs might be able to know. Luckily, I had great photographers who I was working with and who were sort of, we were traveling around Crimea with them, and they were like, okay, Simon, that's a tank. That's a serious piece of hardware. We need to turn the car around and go in the other direction. So luckily, I had people on the ground who were more they had done Iraq, Afghanistan, they'd reported there, so they could sort of fill me in. But I was clueless at that point.
It was around that time that I think the first memes came out about correspondents like us who weren't versed in covering wars, which was it was like what a veteran sees as a tank, and it's like a list of like actual tanks, and then it was like what a journalist calls a tank, and it's like anything with armor, anything with tracks,
anything green.
So we've come a long way. I don't know about you, but now I can tell the differences between
Armored
a T90
vehicle,
and a T60. Yeah.
Yeah. So Sasha, how did you get pulled into this?
Well, even later than both of you guys, before the full-scale invasion, I did some stories on the war in the East, but it was mostly portrait stories. So I did get pretty close to Donetsk airport in 2014, but after that, kind of like most of Ukraine and most of the world forgot about this war and moved on to doing other fun things.
What do you mean by portrait stories? Explain that a little.
Stories that are based on portraits, so, you know, same stuff that we do, just instead of tanks or, you know, other green vehicles that are shooting, you see portraits in the frame, which is kind of, you know, basis of most of my work. But anyway, for me, the war reporting started after the full-scale invasion. I was actually in Brooklyn having a dinner, and as it was kind of like progressing into a drunken dancing portion, one of my friends from Ukraine, he came to me, his wife at home, her parents called her, and he told me it started. I kind of immediately knew what has started. I looked at my phone, and I was already looking at the tickets next day. And then it progressed after that. You know, I was getting kind of closer and closer to the front line. I did take some courses, actually. You know,
Like hostile
environment training. Yeah, I lied about my HEFAD training for the first assignments. You know, they were like, "Well, have you done any war reporting before? Do you have HEFAD training?" I was like, "Of course, I'm a seasoned war reporter."
Quickly Google.
Who are you talking to?
Training.
Yeah,
It just teaches you how to, you know, patch bullet holes and to drag people properly
Yeah,
without hurting your
yeah.
back
Yeah,
to
how to
safety.
use a tourniquet.
How to use a tourniquet.
On
you
a
know, that
tank.
sort of stuff. But it's
Yeah.
required by most news organizations to have. So Sasha's saying that he just lied for many years that he had done this.
not many years. Just the first couple of assignments. I am fully qualified now.
But it's required for insurance, actually. So the publication that you work for needs to be able to tell the insurance company that you have gone through this training, you know how to use a tourniquet and so on. Yeah.
Yes, this is true. And actually, before I began working as a staff reporter, there were plenty of organizations that were happy to hire freelancers who didn't have these things and send us out to do these high-risk assignments without having any of that training or paying for any of that training for us. So,
But the first training I did was actually in March of 22nd, was online, so you can also do it online. And, you know, they send you a little nice certificate, which you can show to your editor.
very nice, very nice. Can I'm going to put my interviewer cap on for just a moment here, because the way we do stories is a bit different. Simon working for Time Magazine, it's a little bit. Please correct me if I'm wrong. You talk about yourself in a moment, but you working for Time Magazine, they're a little bit longer. The reporting period is a little bit longer. The stories are a little bit deeper. Sasha does a little bit of everything lately, working with the Post, working with us at the FT, working with others, doing portraiture, but also I've seen you out in
With
the
Time,
trenches on
too.
the front line. Yep. And with me at the Financial Times, a lot of our focus is daily news. But from time to time, I'll do magazine reporting with our FT magazine as well. So I think we do. I'd be curious to hear how you guys approach your coverage. I mean, to start off, I'm keeping up with things on an hourly basis. You know, I'm reading voraciously every single morning. I'm taking meetings every single day. I probably interview 2 or 3 people, whether they're from Bankova in the presidential administration or someone in the foreign ministry or another ministry or a soldier. I'm seeing them or I'm calling them to get the latest information all the time, because my
And you
editors...
can't ignore news.
You can't.
If a news event happens that's significant, it's on the news agenda of the day, you have to respond. As a
Right,
newspaper.
right. So what do your editors tell you?
I
mean,
I
are
don't
they
have to
saying, are you seeing what Chris Miller's reporting?
Yes, they see what Chris Miller's reporting, and there were periods, I guess in 2014, 2015, when the war began, I was doing more kind of daily news coverage for Time Magazine, mostly for the website, and there were more senior correspondents who would come from New York or from Washington to Ukraine, and I would sort of help them write the longer features. Now, you know, a decade later, I do the features myself, and the rhythm, as you pointed out, is very different. So it's usually a story takes from 1 month to 6 months sometimes. We're usually planning for it to be on the cover, even if it doesn't end up being on the cover, but we have that in mind. What is the image? And also a peculiarity of Time Magazine that's even different, I think, from other magazines, certainly from most other publications, is the focus on the individual. So who is the person, basically, whose face we can put on the cover? Who's the person at the center of the story through whom we can tell the story? So, and that, I think, has shaped a lot of my coverage, certainly, of the full-scale invasion in the last 3 years or so, because, we decided with the editors, and I decided for myself that from the first day, that the person through whom we want to tell the story is President Zelensky. And certain figures around him, but the president was kind of very much in focus, and that guided me in a lot of ways in deciding, okay, where do I need to be to cover this story, and how are we going to tell this story? It's often sort of through the individual. That is something quite peculiar to Time Magazine, and often, when Sasha Maslov gets an assignment from Time Magazine, it's often, you do portraits, right? So you often also get an assignment from a magazine editor.
Or sea drones in your case.
Right, sea drones, also portraits of sea drones. Yeah, we did a story together about naval drones, where no one wanted to be no one wanted their face. I mean, for security reasons and other reasons. So you had to take a portrait of a.
Well, they didn't even want to show us the sea drones themselves, but they had to at some point.
Yeah, I think you had to take a portrait of someone's hands working on the.
And they didn't want a hand, even though the hand was without any markings of tattoos or anything. They didn't even want a hand in the photo because they were terrified that somehow they're going to get identified, which is actually, legitimate concern. And as for your question, Mr. Miller. There's kind of a really wide spectrum of how I come in the story. Sometimes it's people like Christopher or Simon, kind of do all the research, interviewing, background, everything, and then the photo editor emails me and says like, can you come in for a portrait or for something else? And I sashay with my thoughts and camera, and then take one photo, and then post on Instagram that look at the story I did with Christopher Miller. I start, if it's my own story, I do all the research myself, sometimes writing, which is very difficult for me, and photographs, too, which of course is much more time consuming and resources consuming. So it's really a wide spectrum of.
But it wasn't always like that. I remember even, again, 2014, when I would go into the field, and I'm curious if this is the case with you now at the FT, I would go with a photographer. So we would work as a team. Now, mostly for financial reasons, as I understand, the editors sort of wait for me to come back with a story ready to publish, and they're like, okay, how can we illustrate this? And they sort of have a photographer go and work backwards and try to meet the people that I've already met. Very, very inefficient, I think. Maybe cheaper, but it's an interesting kind of evolution or devolution of at least the magazine world that I've seen, where they don't want to commit to sending a photographer into the war zone. Again, expensive insurance, risks of the danger of being in a war zone. Two people being in a war zone is more dangerous than one person, at least according to the bean counters. So that's a change that I've seen in the 10 years of covering this war. That now you go alone and the photographer sort of catches up. Is that still the case with the FT? How has that evolved?
I think with the FT we're a bit unique in that the focus is on the reporting and the text. We're not as focused on images as, say, the Washington Post or the New York Times, who have photographers with them for every assignment, every trip to the front, every interview they go to, they take a photographer, because they want images associated specifically with each interviewee, each article. For me, the FT, and for me personally, I like to move around as light as possible. I don't move around with a photographer oftentimes.
Yeah, same.
It really depends on the assignment. If we think it's a really important story and I don't want to be bothered to try to take my own photos and just want to focus on the interviewing, then I will say, look, we should call Sasha, or we should call so-and-so, whoever's around, to go with us. I like to move around very light. It's me, and I have got one logistics person who is my driver. He sort of works as a fixer with me, and it's the two of us. I don't even move around with a security person anymore, although I do have a security advisor who works remotely. And we don't necessarily need to get into a lot of that, but we're in constant contact. Photographers, honestly, I've been taking more of my own photos lately, much to the chagrin of Sasha here, who would prefer, although I'm not too bad from time to time. I'm not trying to put you out of work. I would prefer to have you take more of the photos. I think in my case, I do maybe fewer feature stories than I used to as a freelancer or as more of a feature-focused reporter at BuzzFeed News. Again, the FT, the demand really is news. I do a lot of writing, a lot of reporting. I would say the features that I do are kind of like you, like focused on a character. And then I get that time with someone, and in those cases, we do get a photographer to go with me. But I'm a bit unique in that we don't do or don't cover it with photos and text in the way that I guess probably the Journal, the Post, and the New York Times would. Yeah.
But there's a benefit to it too, like the story you did in Kherson, for example. I know for sure that some publications that have a security protocol that is more strict would never allow you to go in the city where where the drops and the FPV attacks are so frequent. So if you have that ability, and I kind of enjoy it myself, sometimes when I work on my own stories or stories for publication that have less of a security protocol. Kind of the ongoing joke among journalists is the greatest threat to journalism is the security advisors. So, sometimes if you don't have anybody breathing down your neck, of course you're risking your life a little bit more, but, at the same time you have an ability to go and do a little bit more of an in-depth reporting or closer reporting.
Well, I don't use a security advisor because oftentimes they're big, beefy veterans, oftentimes from British Special Forces, and they do not look like journalists. And they insist on being behind the wheel. They like to act tough, even around very friendly Ukrainian soldiers, and I don't understand why, because you could just be extremely polite, which is what I do, and then I get better access. But also, it's sort of, at times I felt we appear as combatants and not journalists. And I want to fly under the radar as much as possible. And with a security person, it's difficult to do that. So that's another reason that I like to move around very light, mostly on my own.
Yeah, I mean, often that experience that the security experts are bringing to Ukraine is coming from Afghanistan, Iraq, and other wars. And that's true also of war correspondents often. We were talking about this a little bit just before this. We came out here with Chris. There are quite a lot of amazing journalists doing fantastic work who really don't have any background knowledge about Ukraine, the region, the history of the country, and so on. They're war correspondents in the sense that they were based, a few years ago in, say, Libya or Istanbul or whatever, Beirut, covering wars in the Middle East, and then they were kind of sent into Ukraine. It's been interesting for me to observe how they figure things out, and the kinds of stories that they tell are often quite different. What you see from a particular journalist depends to a large degree what their background is. Are they going to tell you the kind of the story of how we got here historically, we as Ukraine, how this war happened, the individual stories. Also, language skills determine a great deal of that. Are you able to really communicate, understand with the people that you're interviewing? I don't mean for this to be an advertisement for kind of regional experts like Chris and I, like Sasha, but there is this distinction, and editors from different publications, they send different kinds of reporters into the field, if they have them. They send both war correspondents who will give you, fantastic reporting about frontline events, the use of different weapons, the emergence of drones is a really decisive factor in this war, things like that. There was a great one recently by C.J. Chivers, who was both actually a Russia expert and an expert in military. I think he served in the military, in the Marines in the U.S. So I think that also is something that readers often aren't aware of or don't think about, but that kind of background of the journalist really determines in many ways what kind of stories we choose to tell and how we tell them, how we're able to tell them. Yeah. Agreed?
Absolutely.
Okay, I've got another question.
Yeah.
I want to talk about access. And you reminded me, Sasha, and Simon, when you were talking about how you were only able to photograph some of these naval drones or this guy's hands, even though it didn't have any identifying tattoos or markings on it. Because, look, we've all been in and out of Ukraine for years now, and access is a challenge. And it's changed quite a lot over the years. I mean, I remember the early days of 2014 where we were crossing the front line on not even a daily basis. Sometimes I'd wake up in Donetsk and it would be under, Russian controlled DNR control, and I'd cross the front line to be with Ukrainian soldiers, and then at night go back and sleep in Donetsk again, right? We would go to the border of Russia and cover some kind of fight out there, and then come back and stay the night in Slavyansk, in Ukrainian-controlled territory. We cannot move across the front line anymore. Our coverage is on one side of this conflict. But within that one side even, there are a lot of restrictions. Now, some of them are understandable for security reasons, obviously. But how do you think about, approaching your subjects, your coverage, what you write about? I mean, you've had great access with Zelensky's camp. I'm sure as, he and his inner circle does with me. We talk about things on the record, and we talk about a lot more off the record. And as a journalist, I think one of the cool things about this job is we know a whole lot. Frustratingly, we know a whole lot more than we're able to publish. But how do you take into consideration those things that you know and you want to publish that could make a great scoop? Or how do you talk your way into a high-profile interview with someone who doesn't really want to sit down with us?
Yeah, there's a lot to build on there. Yeah, I mean, I in terms of access, the first thing that comes to mind, honestly, is I do think back to the 2014 days when that front line was much more. It was dangerous to cross. Crossing it meant going through checkpoints where you could be detained, arrested, beaten.
And many of us were.
And as happened, it happened to me 3 times. So not fun, but it was possible and it was important. And I find it regrettable that basically the Russian-controlled territory is just a no-go zone for journalists, and that includes, for many of us at least, Russia itself. So I've been banned from entering Russia since 2015, largely because of my coverage of the beginning of the war. So in terms of access, I find that very frustrating. I wish that wasn't the case. I would love to be able to go and sort of tell more of that side of the story. In terms of the second part of what you said, just to respond to it, like the access. So I have been really privileged in being able to, certainly in 2022 and into 23, with that focus that I mentioned earlier of the focusing on the individual. President Zelensky and his team were very open to having me basically just hang around. And the book that I wrote and published about a year ago was only possible thanks to that. But the people often ask me, like, how did you get that access? And in many ways, it was just kind of sticking to the story. I first began reporting intensively on Ukraine in 2009, during the elections that put Yanukovych in power. So that kind of commitment to the story, being there. I met Zelensky when he was running for president in 2019. So I think the answer is just being there. And going back to something we talked about just a little earlier, it makes it harder for the journalists who are coming in from Afghanistan or other stories and trying to work their way in and get access into decision-making circles in Ukraine, because they don't have that reputation. Nobody knows them. They don't have the contacts. They don't have the contact list. And I think that is a competitive advantage for reporters like all of us who have been very committed to covering Ukraine for many years. And I think that that is the key to the access. I can only speak for myself that I've had, just knowing the people. When I asked to be able to come in during the first months of the invasion and basically hang around, it wasn't like a stranger coming to Zelensky with that request. He knew me. I had written about him before. We had done a number of interviews. I had spent time with him. I traveled with him to the front. So it was kind of a natural thing for me to come in and ask for that access. If I hadn't spent the years before the full-scale invasion, doing that and building those contacts, he would have said, "Who are you? Get out of here." So I think that's the reason for the access, and I don't really know another way to get access like that. You have to basically just be there, and the one thing, and number two, don't screw people over. So
that's important.
That's
And
important.
be charming.
Charming. I don't know if I have
That's
that.
how Sasha gets.
But
That's how I get
doors,
my
yes,
subjects, yeah.
Yeah. No, I think commitment, time spent, commitment.
Just keep your word, yeah. Like you said, about this sort of publishing things on background. We know more than we were able to publish. Don't. If you've agreed with someone that your conversation is off the record and shouldn't appear in print, don't put it in print. That's what pisses people off. If you do that, and some journalists, I'm not going to name any names, but do that and have built a career on
Name
doing that.
names, Simon.
Not here. Maybe afterward at the reception, but.
Of the record.
That in the long term hurts your access. That's a sort of deep principle that I've learned over the years, that like you can do that and you can get a good scoop by sort of violating the agreement that you have with your sources and saying, okay, yeah, well, I don't need that source anymore. Word gets around, and over time your reputation is also what's gonna get you the access over the long term. So not violating those agreements that you have with your sources and saying like, okay, we're having this conversation off record or on background. There's a sort of spectrum or gradient of these. We can get into that.
I've gotten interviews with high-profile, difficult interviewees because someone has vouched for me and said, he will not screw you over.
Right. Yeah.
You can tell him anything, and if you say off the record, it will be off the record.
Yeah.
Access is such a multifaceted thing. I don't even know where to start. As for personalities, as a photographer, it's easier for me because I bring sometimes nice pictures to people, so it's kind of easier for me to to come in and say like, hey, can we do this? Especially if it's for a book, for example, or for a personal story, or for something I'm working on. I also work, sometimes I help with articles, sometimes I write myself. So it's a little bit easier for me as a photographer, I feel like, because I'm trusted, because I can't do too much damage with a picture,
You're not trying to get them to reveal some secrets
Exactly.
like
Yeah.
we are necessarily.
Although, I can.
I mean, with the drone, the sea drone example, yeah. I mean, they had concerns that your photos could be a real security risk. I mean, that's
Absolutely, and that too, and there's also taking photos. In this work specifically, you have to understand that you actually can do damage. Face recognition technology is at the level that just insane, and of course, state operators have the best technology. If I take a photo of a soldier in the front line, at the moment it gets published, they can find out where this person is from, what their social accounts are, who their family is, et cetera, et cetera.
It doesn't even have to be a state or a government. It can be
Yeah.
us. I mean,
Yeah.
the facial recognition software that we have has helped me write dozens of stories. It doesn't have to be the FSB.
And then as for frontline access, it's, sometimes it's chaos, sometimes it's organized. If something happens, liberation of Kherson or Kursk, first hours, first even days sometimes is total chaos. So you kind of find ways to get in there, and then sometimes you get slapped on a hand or a camera, and then, somebody tells you, no, you were not supposed to be there. But then you get your material, get your story. Like once things settle, kind of bureaucracy comes in, and then you have to get permits. You have to kind of arrange it with the local commander. In Ukraine, it's also, even though it's somewhat of an understandable system, sometimes people within that system don't even understand how those permits work. So sometimes they're like, oh, you got a permit from this buddy, you have to get it from that buddy. You come to a checkpoint, they're like, oh, you're missing a permit from like a head of a village or head of like a local military authority. And it usually gets solved by calling somebody that calls somebody else, and then they let you through. But sometimes, you have to you have to basically find a way around that checkpoint and get to the village from the other side. So it usually works out, but it's somewhat of a chaos.
That's exactly what happened when the Kursk offensive began. I was the first foreign journalist at the border, totally by accident, because there was nothing set up. I was just following a group of soldiers who had their vehicle had broken down, and one of them had to get a ride back to the border to meet part of their unit. So he said, "Can you drive me to this point? Don't worry, it's not in Kursk, but it's nearby." And so he got in the car. There were no checkpoints whatsoever. We just kept driving, and then suddenly it just says, "Welcome to Russia." And we're like, "Oh, okay." And he said, "It's probably not safe to go any further." I said, "No, I don't need to go any further. This is fine. Do you know where to go?" And he said, "Oh, yeah, I've been here before." So he just got out, got picked up by somebody else, and they went in. We stayed there, conducted some interviews with Ukrainian soldiers who were coming out, wrote a great story after I got back to Sumy, the regional capital, and then I think I remember I went back the next day. It was the same situation, had great interviews. Everybody was riding pretty high. The soldiers were very open to speaking. I went to Kiev for 2 days to do some other work and the interviews that I had there already lined up. I went back, and everything was already, had changed completely. Every checkpoint, there was an SBU officer, a security service guy checking documents. There was, military personnel, and suddenly there was now, what am I trying to say? A protocol. You got to call this person who talks to this person who talks to this person, and it's been that way since now. Yeah, but you're right. If you can get in early, quickly, and under the radar, you get great access.
Yeah, remember CNN on the first day of the Kherson liberation, they got in by personal connection, and then they got their accreditation taken off, as an example, even though, of course, they got it back later on. And then it was impossible to get in Kherson. I was able to get in Kherson the second day, also without any permits, but in a military vehicle, which of course, I'm not supposed to do either. But that was the only way to get in there, So it's kind of like, it's a chance, and there's so many chances, like broken vehicles, or, somebody's hitching a ride, or you hear somebody. It's just, it's somewhat
Thinking
of a
on your
random thing.
feet, yeah.
And there's so many stories, especially from before the full-scale invasion, where, reporters kind of got lost or just accidentally crossed the separation line and were in the Russian-controlled territory. Of course, now you can't do that. You can't. And funny thing also, once you pass into what's called the red zone, you pass multiple checkpoints, et cetera, you get checked by SBU. But once you get closer to the front line, there's no checkpoints, total anarchy. You can you can fly on a car anywhere you want. You can drive to to the zero line if you're not gonna get there, of course. Because of the FPV drones, now it's extremely dangerous to just be there anywhere close to the front lines, because you're gonna get taken out.
Those have had a huge impact on my coverage, at least. Drones are everywhere. I was at the Eastern Front in Pokrovsk, in Karakovo. These are all cities in Donetsk Oblast out in the southeast in September and October. And then, of course, the months prior to that, and the year prior, and 2022 as well. And each time I've gone out there, it's become more terrifying, simply not only because of tank shells or artillery fire, those types of things, which are to be expected, and we've been around those since 2014. What is different is the prevalence of drones. They are everywhere, and I can't tell you how many times we took a left here or a right here and went down this road, and were stopped by a group of Ukrainian soldiers who said, "Don't go any further. There are FPV or first-person drones all over this highway. They've been hitting us all day. We haven't been able to make it to Karakovo." And so we had to, backtrack and go this long roundabout way. And it set us back hours. And one of the interviews we wanted to do, we weren't able to do at all. Another one we had to reschedule for the following day. So it's really interrupted how we report, which means we're not able to provide that full picture sometimes that we're after, simply because of the prevalence of these machines, which, some of them are no bigger than, this little mic stand, right? With a couple of propellers, 4 propellers on either side. Some of them are bigger and a little bit scarier too.
Yeah, and it gets very dystopian, in terms of getting closer to the front line. This summer I was in Nikopol, which is a town in the south of Ukraine, really right on the front line. It's right across the river from the nuclear power plant that has been occupied by the Russians since March of 2022. And I spent the day with the local mayor. And the really dystopian situation there is the Russians have apparently set up a drone training base inside the occupied nuclear power plant, where they have their soldiers sit and basically hunt the residents, the civilian residents of Nikopol across the river, to teach those Russians how to kill, how to get a moving target, how to fly into somebody's garage as they're trying to park their car in the garage. These kinds of horrors of the war. They're training their soldiers apparently using Nikopol as a kind of training ground.
And Kherson too, which
Same
is
as
the
Kherson.
story,
Yeah,
that,
Kherson,
the story that I did that you mentioned earlier. I went to Kherson in when was it, November, late November, and I was with the regional governor there, and he warned me before coming down. He said if you can, wait till the weather is bad, and we did wait until it was the stormiest, cloudiest, rainiest day, and he said you chose the best day to come down here, and I actually liked this, and I used it as the last line of my story. He said, we really love London weather around here now. Because a clear day means Russian drones are going to be everywhere. And in Kherson, they are attacking the civilian population. They're not looking for military vehicles, although those are, nice targets for them. They're attacking city buses, marshrutkas. They're attacking people walking down the street, going to supermarkets. And so the day that I was down there was actually one of the busiest days of the month, because people could finally they finally felt safe enough to go to the market to get their eggs, and the market was actually open, and people were selling their wares and produce, and many of the people I spoke to there said it was the first time they'd been out in days. One guy I spoke to, I wanted to do an interview with him because, for various reasons, the village he's in has no one left. It's just on one of the bank of the Dnieper River near Kherson, and he said, "I'm sorry, I can't come to see you. I don't leave during the day." He only comes out at night wearing all black on a motorcycle, and he rides as fast as he can without any lights on. And that's the only time he leaves.
Yeah, I can't tell how many times I've heard the word drone, after which, absolute chaos ensues. And, if you want to see near the front lines, like people running in different directions or driving very fast, just scream drone and everybody's gonna run and hide. But it is an amazing story, Chris, the Kherson story, and I recommend everybody to read it. It's crazy and it's dystopian. It's absolutely just unspeakable. But Russians have set up these bases. They're training on civilians. Why? Because just imagine in a computer game, it's like level 1 for them. Slower moving targets, simpler, just absolutely no regard for human life. So they're training their new recruits on civilians in order for them to be better, so to speak, on military targets later. And of course, that turned life in these cities, which was already very difficult and dangerous, into just absolute hell.
I think one of the interesting things about covering this war is the contrasts. You've got machines out there that are decades old, right? They're coming out of Soviet stockpiles, and then you've got these new, death drones, and a lot of times the answer to one problem is some kind of new technology, but sometimes the answer is going back in time, like some of the soldiers, so that they can avoid having their communications disrupted or overheard by the Russians, will use these old field phones that were used, I think, in the First World War and Second World War, and they're old cables. They look like something on just some war movie that you would have seen back in 1950 or something, right? About the Second World War, about Germany or Leningrad or whatever it is, and they'll use them because they can't be hacked. It's just really remarkable. Or now the thing with the FPV drones is they're using not the ones that are cableless and flying around that can go for dozens and dozens of miles, because now there are ways in which both sides, the Ukrainians and Russians, can knock those down using jammers and technology. So they're using drones with fiber optic cables. So they're using these kind of older technologies mixed with these new technologies.
The
So
drone
they're
is
really
literally
jarring.
attached to a string as
Yeah,
it's
a
flying.
very, it's
Yeah.
a very
It's
skinny,
crazy.
tiny string, and it's just it just
Passes the
unrolls.
image. Yeah, passes the image back.
Yeah, and now the entire front line is kind of like there are webs of these little strings everywhere, and if you see those, that means you're very close already.
We should probably make some time for questions. Yeah, this is fascinating. I like
fine?
where
Yeah.
we've leaded to, but Lydia, what do you think? Should we?
I'm happy to keep just grilling these guys
open
up
it
here
up?
if you'd like.
I think we're all mesmerized, but
We're about-
maybe we should.
45 minutes in? Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I just wanted to give you a chance to.
Q&A.
Yeah,
Why don't we do that? I did forget to mention a few things. One is that we're videoing the event, and we will hopefully release that on our YouTube channel eventually. And I didn't ask you guys, I know that some people are taking clips. Are you okay with anything going on social media? Would you like people to wait? Are we cool?
I'm not a big user of social media.
Okay.
No, I'm fine with that.
Yeah.
All good.
The other thing is, at the end, please don't forget to mention books. Everyone has books here. Paperbacks are being launched. And we've got an amazing book from Sasha as well. So anyway, should we move to Q&A? What do you think?
Sure.
Great.
Sure.
Well,
I
since
figured you
have the
guys would
mic,
want to
I
also
get
get a
go
chance to.
first, because I do that. At the risk of getting sort of the superficial answer of your devotion and everything else, I'm curious. You've described some pretty harrowing scenarios here. Why do you do this? Why do you go back?
I don't know how to do anything else.
That was my answer. Well, in all seriousness, I've invested quite a lot in this story. I came to Ukraine in 2010, and as I mentioned before, felt pretty hard for the country, and it's been a major part of my journalism career as well. I made very close friends and I've built relationships with people not only in the last 2 or 3 years, but I'm still very close with a lot of my friends from Bakhmut in 2010, who were the first people I met when I came there, and I care a lot about them, and I've seen the country change in so many ways, mostly positive ways, and I feel very invested, and I think it is a very, very important story to tell. Evidence of me speaking the truth right now is the fact that I did not leave Ukraine to go off and take up another beat or another story after 2014, 2015. There were not very many journalists who stuck around and did a lot of coverage. I mean, you guys kept coming back and did a lot of coverage as well. I did the same. A lot of people went off and they moved to Beirut, like we said, or Istanbul or whatever it was. I had opportunities to do that. I tried my hand at a few other things, but like Simon, I can't do anything else. So I've been there, but it's because I think it's really important, and I'll leave it there and let Simon answer.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, I would feel like it's a waste of all of the kind of background knowledge, the contacts, the context that I've developed over these many years of reporting on Ukraine. If I went off and wrote about cartels in Mexico, that would also be dangerous. Okay, yeah, but whatever. Or Silicon Valley, something else. I could probably do that. I would find it interesting, and I have done that periodically over the years, covered something completely different. But I feel I'm most useful, and my experience is most useful to readers if I focus on Ukraine and these stories that are just very important to tell. They're very complicated. The history is complicated. The language skills are not as common as one would hope. So yeah, that's what keeps me coming back.
I would add that it's a challenge. You said it's not easy. I mean, it's a challenge. Like it's an extremely complex place, which as a journalist is a fun test to take on too, right? And I'm always learning, which is another reason why.
For me, building on what Simon and Chris said, it's also very personal, of course. I was born in Ukraine and grew up there. it's also important to take part by observing in these events because, of course, it's history, and I feel like we're kind of on the brink of world changing to something that we have never seen before. So it's, besides just being interesting, it's important to understand better the situation, to kind of put another piece in the kind of endless puzzle of a really complex situation that's forming in Ukraine and Europe and the world. And yeah, at this point, I just can't imagine doing anything else.
Great, okay. I think we're going to have a lot of Q&A. Please keep your question brief and keep it a question.
No insulting Christopher.
How often are you in the field? To anybody, how often are you in the field, and how does this affect your family life if you're in for long periods of time?
I feel like that's the question we discuss every time
Yeah.
at a bar in Kiev.
Well, I spent a lot of time there. I'm a full-time, Ukraine correspondent for the Financial Times, so I'm almost always there. But you need a break because it is extremely intense, and when I am there, I am always on. I'm on call all the time. If something happens, I'm writing it. I'm reporting on it. I'm there covering it. And so my rotation, so to speak, it's kind of like an oil rig job. I'm out there for roughly 2 months, and then I come back here to New York and take a break for a few weeks. Sometimes I bring a bit of reporting with me, and I'll work on, say, a feature story or a magazine story or some editing or something while I'm here. From time to time, something will happen, and my editors will say, "Look, you have, can you jump on this story for us? Or we know you've got a contact. Can you help us out with this story?" Even when I'm on break here at home. I am really devoted to my job, and it's really hard for me to switch off. And so I feel like I'm always working, even if I'm not there in the field. That has, it's had an effect on me. I think, on my family and my wife too, and I know that they worry about me, and there are times that it has been difficult, being home and trying to switch off and be present. I feel like I've gotten a lot better at that. But it is something that I think, I think I wasn't great at it before. I think now that I've been doing it for a lot longer, I've gotten better about doing that. And fortunately, I have an employer, the FT, that is really understanding, much more than any organization I've ever worked for, in giving me that space and time that I need to sort of unwind and detach from the intense work that I do when I come home to take a break.
Yeah, I just add in terms. I have a daughter, 7 years old, so she was born during the war. The first couple of years of covering the war, 2014, 2015. So, I look back on some of the risks that I took and the amount of time that I spent in Ukraine. I wouldn't do that now. So it really does change the calculation, having a child. So 2022, I was gone. I was away from home reporting in Ukraine for about 6 months of the year, if you add it all up. That was a big strain on my family, and I've sort of reduced the trips. I try to keep them as tight as possible, but that, as Chris alluded to, makes them much more intense. So when you are there, and you say, okay, I need to get back to my family as soon as reasonable. That means every hour, every moment that you're in the country, you're trying to maximize that with interviews, with trips, with whatever you can get to report, to sort of contribute to your stories. But yeah, also just the risk calculation is different. It changes, the bigger your family.
I'm not the best person to answer that question, so I'm gonna pass.
That was Sasha's way of saying he's a bachelor and available.
You can find him on Instagram.
Hi, I first want to thank you for your work that you do. It's very, very important, especially for people who don't live in Europe and need to be able to learn about what's going on in Ukraine. My question is, have you ever come across an enemy combatant in the front lines? And if so, have you also ever been injured?
I have not been injured. I've seen, well, when you say enemy combatant, I am not. I mean, I'm depending on which. I assume you mean Russians, or Ukrainians who are fighting on the Russian side in Donetsk, Lugansk. The answer is, I mean, yes, those who would be hostile to an American reporter working for Western media, absolutely. Plenty of them, a lot of them, too many of them maybe. I've gotten into some sticky situations, as Simon mentioned. Many of us have been detained for various lengths of time. Fortunately, I haven't been, too roughed up, and I haven't been, injured. And part of that is just, my own risk calculation. I'm not a big cowboy. I don't go out there looking for like the bang bang. I much prefer to find a place where I can speak to people and get their story and interview them. But it does come with the territory that you're going to bump into some nasty people who are going to treat you terribly and accuse you of all sorts of things and threaten you with various things. And I remember the first times that happened to me were in 2014 in Gorlovka and Donetsk, and with people like Igor Strokov and Igor Bezler, all these sort of warlords that helped Putin start his invasion in 2014. Since 2022. No, I haven't come across any of them because I'm only able to report from the Ukrainian side of the front line. And like Simon, I can't go to Russia, which means I can't cross into the Russian-controlled side of the front line. And I think that probably the risk in doing so now, even if we were allowed into Russia to move around and to operate within Russian-occupied territories, the risk would be so great. I'm not sure that I would do it if I were able to.
Yeah, just to emphasize that, I mean, the risk is that you're dead. So Russians treat journalists now, just based on their actions, as enemy combatants, and they target journalists. So the risk is that. Back in 2014, when it was more of this kind of shadow war, Russia was using a lot of paramilitaries, proxies, and so on. Some of those warlords would allow journalists to come in to sort of to whatever report. I mean, they
had egos too. They wanted to be on the front page of Time
yeah.
magazine as well. Yeah.
And there the risks were just lower. Yeah. So I was detained a number of times. I was beaten up once, by Russian sort of proxy forces or Russian pro-Russian separatists, whatever term of art you prefer. But those risks were pretty vanilla compared to today. So today it's just too dangerous to even think about approaching Russian forces because they'll just kill you. I mean, the risk of that is very high.
Yeah, that's correct. You're not gonna see any cars with a big press printed on them on the roof or on the sides, or blue jackets even at this point close to the front line, because you're becoming a target for an FPV or for whatever. As for enemy combatants, Russians, I only photographed people who were already taken prisoners, both kind of shortly after they've been taken prisoners in detention centers and kind of during the exchanges on the way back to Russia, kind of in the buses. And I've spoken with some of them. Most of them will tell you that they're just bus drivers and cooks and they've been, they've been told that they're Nazis in Ukraine, and they believed it, and et cetera, but they never touched a gun, et cetera. So it's not really like a good way to understand exactly what they're really experiencing, because it's also all the journalists are concerned about ethical aspect of interviewing prisoners of war. To be clear, they're treated very well in Ukraine compared to how people are being treated in Russia. And Ukrainians are doing everything to show that and to actually do that, just to show that, like, look, we're actually playing by the rules. But it's still, even during the interviews, oftentimes the guards or SBU guys will tell you, we're going to leave you to talk whatever you want, like, and they tell the prisoners, like, you don't have to talk with them, you can tell. So they're kind of, Ukrainians are doing extra work to show that, like, look, we're doing it all right. But it's still kind of, little strange.
The only other times I've seen enemy combatants, Russians, has been through binoculars or even with my bare eye in some places. Earlier in 2022, there were some places in Bakhmut where the Russians were so close on the other side of the river that you could see them dart between houses. And then at other times I've been in trenches with soldiers where, they've got the little periscopes and we're looking at them, move across the way and whatnot. Yeah.
I've heard them once. That's
Yeah.
that's
Actually,
how close. Yeah.
That's another thing. Yeah, and a little bit. I wrote once that I was in a trench, and these soldiers, the Ukrainians, were telling me, we can hear them complain about being here. Like, it's cold, it's wet, we don't get enough food. They're cursing in Russian very colorfully, and they say, yeah, they're going through the same stuff that we are.
Yeah, one little point I'd point out. So for a writer, so for a photographer, it's in many ways, at least in my experience, working with photographers, it's very important for them to be able to see these kinds of things, to get as close as possible despite the danger. Writers generally are able to hang back. We have the luxury of sort of, you can't do an interview while there are bombs falling or someone's shooting at you. So generally, we kind of are able to stay farther away from the front line. At least we have the option of doing that while still doing our jobs, compared to photographers and videographers.
A good editor once told me, no dead journalist has ever filed a story. And so, yeah, it was his way of saying you don't need to chase after the shooting at the front line.
So I have an idea, because there's so many people that want to ask questions. What do you prefer? Our questioners can select one of you, or you decide among yourselves who will answer a question, and then maybe
We can take a couple questions at the same time, and maybe Sasha answers one, maybe Simon answers one, maybe we don't all
Okay.
three have to answer
Right.
each one.
And so you want to decide among yourselves?
Sure. That's fine. Okay, just don't blame me if I don't go in the order that you would like. Yeah, sure. Gentleman right here with the fantastic handlebar mustache.
Oh, sorry. You can have the mic next.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
That's
You
okay.
don't have a mustache though, but we'll allow it.
I'm curious if you have a sense of what the media environment is like, sort of on the Russian side of the conflict. Do you come across people reporting for Russian publications? Do you have a sense of, like, is there independent journalism and information sharing on the other side of the conflict, so to speak? Like, what that looks like?
I think Simon is a better suited person to answer that, right?
Yeah, I guess so. I'm good friends with a lot of Russian journalists. They're the independent Russian journalists who fled Russia when the invasion started and are now trying to report from exile. Some of them are based in Amsterdam, some of them are based in Berlin, some in New York, and I stay in touch with them. A lot of them are my good friends from when I was based in Moscow, long before the war. And they have a very hard time. A lot of them now have a legal status in Russia that makes it illegal for someone to even talk to them. So that makes it very difficult to report. So if someone grants them an interview and their name is printed in that publication, then they could go to jail, the person who's being interviewed. So the restrictions that Russia has set on independent journalism are so draconian and twisted. The example that you often hear is, technically, according to Russian law, you could be sent to prison for 15 years for calling the war a war as opposed to a special military operation. right? So technically, calling it a war could be construed by Russian prosecutors as what's called discrediting the Russian army, which is punishable by up to 15 years. So, you know, the kinds of things we're talking about in terms of the restrictions on Russian journalists trying to do their jobs, independent Russian journalists, are just, I mean, they're beyond anything we could have imagined. My book, a book in English, was banned in Russia and the language that they used was really bizarre. It was like a threat to national security, economic security, and the morals of the citizens of Russia or something like that. You know, a book in a foreign language. So, you know, they're really going all out. So, to answer your question, there's really very little breathing room for people trying to do independent journalism in Russia or even about Russia.
But there are several Russian journalists, especially the ones that have been in Ukraine before the full-scale invasion, that are working in Ukraine and trying to report for the Russians that are reading those news. That's another thing. It's like a lot of Russians are not going to even read Meduza or other independent Russian media because they're so kind of entrenched in the propaganda they've been fed through TV and the state media that they considered those independent journalists are just puppets of the West. My website is also banned in Russia.
Thank you. Regarding the off-the-record comments you made, you're reporters, but you can't report. What is the benefit or the value to you with these off-the-record interviews? Is it to learn more about the individual person, or what is the value?
Good question. So let me completely undercut myself for one moment here and just say, when I am invited to meetings that are off the record with someone at the most senior level, so let's say the foreign minister or President Zelensky, 99% of the time I actually turn them down and I say no. Because at that level they should be able to speak for themselves, for the country, for their ministry, and I don't think there's any reason for them to say this entire thing is off the record. If they want to speak to me, we can speak, about some things off the record, and I'm of course going to come and take this meeting because it's an opportunity to ask you some difficult questions that otherwise I wouldn't be able to, and try to get some responses on the record. Sometimes we agree to something in the middle called on background, where we can't use the name, and that's when you see in our articles sometimes we'll say according to a Western official or according to a senior person with knowledge of the situation.
Source familiar with the
Source familiar. It gets pretty silly, honestly, sometimes, but I will allow people to speak with me off the record at length because it can be helpful context. And it can also be something that helps me to know whether or not I should be publishing something. Like, I try not to go into meetings with very many preconceived notions. I don't want to go in and pretend I know what Zelensky is going to do already, right? But I will go into his office and either speak with him or oftentimes his chief of staff, Andrei Yermak, or people who work for them. And we'll speak on the record, but then we'll speak off the record. And I know that that's my time where I can say, look, I've heard some things. These are those things. Is there any truth to them? Is this something you think that, we should be following? How important is this? And that provides what I think is useful context. And it also is an opportunity for them to say, you were asking about these things earlier. I wouldn't really, put too much weight in this or that. And it can help me sort of navigate my own reporting and figure out what is, what is worth looking into and following. It can be just extremely valuable because it's an opportunity to speak very honestly between two people who hopefully respect each other enough that they're not going to break that code, that agreement.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is, you alluded to this, it helps you know what questions to ask of other sources. So you talk to someone off the record, you know things, so you know you can go out then and try to confirm that information on the record through other sources, such that you can then deliver it to the readers. That's a very frequent kind of process that goes on.
Sure. I think here
We've all seen the coverage of the war evolve and unfortunately decline in volume, particularly since the full-scale invasion. I'm interested in what kinds of stories your editors are commissioning you to write about at this stage of the war, and how that corresponds with what you'd actually like to be writing about or photographing. Thank you.
Sure. There was a few declines, of course, after 2022 and 2023. It's normal that people lose interest, but also we can see that this war is unique in a way that actually it still maintains frontline coverage and kind of like one of the main avenues of reporting in the world. Partially it's because both journalist community and just the readers understand that this is the war that will determine how what we call the Western civilization will develop, because that's kind of a turning point between the East and the West, collective East, collective West, right? So reporting, hasn't declined that much. Just the stories started repeating themselves because there were so many stories. In the beginning, we saw so many stories about IT specialist yesterday, soldier today, cook yesterday, volunteer today, et cetera, all these kind of heroic stories. And it became more about the grind, more about the slowly moving front lines, et cetera. So just the readers get tired of the stories that look the same. And on the front line, that's thousands of kilometers, and the country that's at war with much bigger adversary. There's so many stories that are kind of repeating itself. So we have to find new stories all the time. In photography, I'm interested in what's not being covered visually, because you can see, especially on The Wire, you can see so many photos of tanks shooting, or soldiers kind of in the trenches. So I'm trying to find stories that are kind of untold and that I can use my type of photography, which is mostly portraits, to go and tell that story. What about you guys?
We don't have a huge team in Kiev. It's myself and one other reporter, and so we don't have the luxury of being able to cover everything. I think that's actually a benefit. My editors certainly think that too. We can be pickier and choosier about our stories, so we can decide what we think is most important to cover. For us, it's not the bang bang in the trenches type stuff. Like, as I mentioned earlier, we don't have a heavy focus on photography from the front line or frontline dispatches. I ask my editors from time to time, can I please go back to the front line? I feel like I need to, just touch base and get a sense of what has changed since the last time I was there. I might make a trip out somewhere to a frontline area once a month now. That used to be, much more frequent in 2022, or certainly 2024 or 2014, 2015. I basically lived along the front line and was reporting around that area all the time. For me and for the FT, our focus is, really the stakes, halls of power type stuff, politics, policy. What does Trump have in store for Ukraine? How is Zelensky going to respond? How is Europe going to respond? What we are really good at the FT, and if you read my colleague's story today about this, it was, Trump changing his tune from going to saying, I'm going to solve this in 24 hours, to his team now talking about how they're going to give it some time, and consider a bit more how they're going to do this, because Trump doesn't want to be a loser. He wants to be a winner, right? And now this timeline has grown to 100 days or 6 months, something like that. And we spoke with a bunch of people off record, on background, and on the record, to try to report, or my colleagues did, a complete picture about what is being discussed right now, about how this conflict could be solved or could wind down, right? So for me, I'm always looking to speak to people about and then write about what comes next and what the cost is going to be and what the stakes are.
Yeah, one more point on this, because I think it's such an important question, and it's something that I grapple with all the time, keeping Ukraine in focus, keeping the stories at the front of people's minds. I feel it's part of my mission to keep people focused, but the reality is that in the last 3 years, the decline in readership. So my editors are sitting there, they're seeing how many people are clicking on the stories that we publish about Ukraine, and the decline has been really quite painful and sad to see. The other thing I'd note is, I think Ukraine is lucky to have a president who's so aware of these dynamics of communication and persuasion and PR. Honestly, I remember having a conversation with the president in April 2022. This was at a time when Ukraine was, the coverage of Ukraine was everywhere. It was on all the TV networks, on all the front pages, and so on. And he then told me, Simon, we're on the clock. This is going to stop. Very soon, we need to get as much support and weapons and win the hearts and minds now while we have the attention, because the attention is going to run out. Because people will get sick of, as he put it, seeing the same blood from the same nation day in and day out. They can't follow routine. So he has found some very creative ways that I try to write about in the book in some detail, to keep that attention, keep the world's attention focused on Ukraine. And I think he's done that more effectively than many leaders would have, in large part because of his background in television, in entertainment, in producing films and so on. He knows how this medium works, and he's able to really see and respond to and prepare for that decline and try to combat it. But it's a losing fight, as he knew way in the beginning of the full-scale invasion. He knew that he's on the clock, and the people's attention span will run out, and tragically it is running out. And that translates directly into declining support financially and militarily for Ukraine.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I'm wondering if there is a common mood of the Ukrainian people, and when I say Ukrainian people, I'm not talking about like the frontline soldiers or government that know everything that's going on, but Kiev and to the west, as far as what the trajectory of the war is, and especially now when maybe things aren't looking as good with Russian advances and maybe not getting the equipment that they were getting. And if there is, are you able to sense that, and can you comment on that?
I actually think attitudes vary quite a lot depending on which region of the country you live in, and if you've had to flee the east to the west, or you've got a son who's about to turn 18 or about to turn 26. I would say, if I had to generalize very broadly the entire country, I would say the mood is, people are tired, yet they remain determined. Now, some people are just more on the tired side. There are others who I think their attitudes have hardened. They're much more on the determined side of that. But I think everybody who I know personally, and this is obviously not scientific, it's very anecdotal, but everybody is exhausted. But to varying degrees, they remain defiant and determined to see this to an end that benefits Ukraine. I will say that and polls also indicate this, that people are starting to think about, the balance between continuing and the losses that are sure to come with continuing the fight, and weighing that against finding some kind of a solution, I use that word loosely in this case, that could represent either something like a bad ceasefire in which there are no security guarantees that might dissuade Russia from attacking after regrouping some months later, or something that hopefully would provide Ukraine with security guarantees enough to dissuade Russia from launching another attack. But polls show that people are softening their positions on what Ukraine might, or Zelensky, what they want their president to consider in negotiations. Fair enough? Oh, yeah. It's okay. We'll make it there. Okay, sure.
No, nie dziękuję. No thanks. Sir, no thanks. Sir. That's just a personal tick. It's nothing important. I was hoping one or two you might have some story about your experience interviewing some particularly colorful character who was particularly difficult to interview. Not necessarily high ranking, but colorful and difficult to interview. How that went.
I feel like there's many.
Difficult to interview.
So many. We had one interview with Christopher. I'm not gonna name the name, but we waited for a very long time, and then that person showed up and said, "You know what? I'm not gonna do the interview. I'm just gonna do the photos, even though I don't like to be photographed." But then we see and then we see that person wearing makeup.
They, yes, this is someone I had spent quite a lot of time with, and was trying to meet with this person frequently to sort of put together an image of this person and who they are, and they became I guess tired of meeting with me, and one day just had enough and said no more, but we'll do the photos of Sasha. And yes, came out with the whole thing, and was happy to give him 45 minutes of time that was allotted for my interview.
Yeah, it was. I think 10 minutes was scheduled for photographs.
Yes, yeah, 10 minutes, but it became 45. You probably want to hear something about like in 2014 running into. I mean, something that sticks with me because it wasn't a very pleasant experience. It's one of those things where, like, in hindsight, you can joke about it with your buddies over a beer or something. I mentioned it in my book as well. But I got stopped at a checkpoint, one of these checkpoints in eastern Ukraine, and there was a sign, leading up to it, and that should have told me it was a bad idea to try to cross because it said "Dobro pожаловать в ад," welcome to hell. And I was like, oh great, these guys are going to be wonderful to deal with. And of course, they didn't like the fact that I was American, and they asked me, not very politely, to get out of my vehicle, and they sent my driver on my way, and I was stuck with them for about 4.5 hours. They gave me many cigarettes and a lot of coffee, in between all of the threats and the telling me what they were going to do to me, and then they said we have to wait for word from our boss. And I said, who is your boss? And they said, Igor Bezler. And Igor Bezler was this really nasty guy who they called, his nom de guerre or call sign was the Demon. Not a guy you'd want to cross paths with. And he was the sort of warlord overseeing Gorlovka in 2014. He had a big mustache. And just a few days before, he had carried out this mock execution of these Ukrainians. It became pretty well known, and it was videoed, and he released it, and it looked like he actually killed them. We didn't know for several days later that he actually didn't, and I had to sit there in this like dugout in this checkpoint, talking to these guys, trying to calm them down, but also trying to do a little bit of reporting, trying to glean whatever information I could, and listening to Igor Bezler scream over the radio. Who is he? What does his face look like? Does he have calluses on his fingers? Check his fingers, because he wanted to know if I was a sniper. And anyway, things like that. I had one interview, one last one. I'll mention this. Do you remember there was he was a Russian guy by the name of Alexander Borodai. And he was the so-called prime minister of Donetsk when Russia was not at all involved in 2014, of course, in Donetsk, right? And he used to come to the hotel late at night and drink a lot and smoke a lot. And one night I went over and sat next to him in the booth, and we had this long debate about whether or not Russia was involved. And he's like, no, these are just people who want to separate and be independent. I was like, you use the word separate. That's interesting. So this is separatism, or is it annexation? What? And we had this philosophical debate about words and phrases, and I couldn't get anything really out of him because he was this really slick, Kremlin-friendly PR guy. He was
literally
appointed.
a PR guy, yeah. His background was in PR. Yeah.
Super slippery. Lots of those guys in 2014 and stuff. I don't know. These days it's mostly trying to get information out of people who don't really want to give us things because everything is so sensitive. Which one? Borodai, no, he's still alive. Yeah. Besler, was he? Okay, no, yeah. Borodai is still alive. He's gained a lot of weight and his hair is gray and he's, living it up in Moscow somewhere. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your objective reporting. I commend all three of you on the spectacular work that you've done. If I could ask you to put your subjective hats on, because you have on the record, off the record, and on background interviews. So you have access to information. And so sitting where you sit and what you know, and as we enter the third year of this horrible war, how do each of you see an outcome? What is your view of not how this ends, but what do you expect to happen in the next year? Based on what you know as insiders. I know it's a sensitive question. I don't want you to cross any boundaries, but I think that's why everyone came here today. I'm addressing the elephant in the room.
We work with the present and the recent past. The future is not our business. There are many analysts who work on prognostication. I'm a very bad prognosticator historically. There's a headline that people always throw at me on social media from 2014. I wrote an article that said no, Russia will not annex Crimea or something like that. So when I try to guess the future, I'm often wrong. But just sort of looking at some trend lines and where my sources in Kiev, what they're thinking about coming around the corner. Yes, they're all bracing themselves for whatever the peace proposals come out of the incoming Trump administration. The Trump administration, I have heard from sources on that side that there are some pretty serious, well-informed people working on a set of terms to be presented to Zelensky and to the Russian side. From what I know of those terms, I mean, some of it has appeared in the public. For example, there was an interview that J.D. Vance gave where he alluded to some of this stuff, like a demilitarized zone in the Donbass that isn't given away to Russia, but isn't really under Ukrainian control either, and it's heavily fortified to deter Russia from attacking again. These kinds of things are sort of floating around in the Trump world and are indications of the kind of deal that they're preparing to present to both sides. The ideas that I know to be in the Trump world are very far from what would probably be acceptable to both President Zelensky and to Putin. So neither side would. So the proposals that seem to be coming from Trump's camp don't match at all the demands of either the Ukrainian or the Russian side. So where does that lead us? In the very short term, that leads us to quite a diplomatic dead end. And I think that's why, according to the Financial Times reporting today, Trump is now being like, actually 24 hours is a little short, give me 6 months. Because he knows that the positions are very far apart. But let's say there is some agreement reached. Both sides are very tired. The military resources are pretty close to exhausted, I think, on both sides to differing degrees. I do hear from my sources in the Ukrainian military that they need a pause to mobilize more forces, get more weapons, to train more brigades and so on. So they need this too. So I think as much as there's hesitation publicly to admit that some kind of deal needs to happen, some kind of pause in the fighting, some ceasefire is coming, that in more kind of background conversations, I've heard from a number of military officers too that they're like, we need a pause. So what does that look like? Looking now a little bit further ahead, does that mean some kind of deal, say, wherever they draw that line of demarcation, however it's fortified, whoever controls it, does that then mean Ukraine lifts martial law? internal to Ukrainian politics. That's a very important question that I know that the Ukrainian administration, Zelensky administration, is thinking hard about. At what stage do we lift martial law, and how soon after that are there, processes like elections begin to be called? So under martial law, it is illegal to hold an election in Ukraine. Once you lift martial law, you need to think quite soon about holding an election. What does that look like? And there, looking ahead to trend lines, I think there is. And now we're possibly more than a year. You asked about a year, but I think maybe end of 2025. Now we're talking maybe into 2026. I think there is a great demand in society for new political forces to emerge in the Ukrainian context that have some military background. There's so many families and so many millions of Ukrainians have been touched by the war directly, with their either having served themselves in the military or very close relatives serving. That there is, I've heard from serving politicians, there's a great demand for some kind of military party or some political force that can speak the language of veterans. So I think looking ahead now, beyond a year to a possible resumption of normal democratic political processes happening in Ukraine, I think that's something that I would look at and watch closely, and I have been. Who would those forces be? Who would be those political forces? Could it be someone like Petro Poroshenko, who has historically, staked out a pretty I would even say hardline or militaristic political positions? Could it be him? Is it someone else? So these are the things. But now we're pretty far into the future. I think in the immediate few months, everybody is just bracing themselves, like I said in the beginning, for what's Trump going to put on the table. And I think just last point. The Ukrainian side, and I've written about this. The Ukrainian side is expecting Trump to pretty quickly be disappointed by his attempts to deal with Putin. So the Ukrainian side is looking at the next 6 months, and they see, yes, Trump is probably going to attempt some kind of reset in relations with Putin. Previous administrations in the U.S. have done that too. Barack Obama, the famous перезагрузка. But Trump's going to attempt that too. It's clear. The Ukrainians are looking at that and they're saying, Putin is a maniac and a liar. Trump is going to realize that sooner or later. Once he does, there will be an opportunity diplomatically for Ukraine to win Trump more commitment from Trump to support Ukraine. Is that naive? Not my position to say, but that is something that in terms of looking ahead to the next few months, that the Ukrainian administration is talking about.
I think maybe that's where we wrap it up for now with the group. A few things. Well, first, let's give a round of applause for. Okay, now we're going to talk logistics and books. So Chris's book, Simon's book are available for purchase here, and they're going to be signing books out there. Sasha also has a few copies of his book. Yes? Great. It's a beautiful book with portraits. A few events that are coming up that I wanted to let you know about also. We are planning an exhibition of portraits from the book Saints that Sasha has done on Friday, January 24th. And we'll be sending out information soon. We have an amazing event on Monday evening that's just come together with the mission, the Ukrainian mission at the UN, where we will host 3 formerly incarcerated Ukrainian prisoners here, one from the Azov battalion, one Crimean activist, and the third, I don't remember. It's our members have been invited. It's an invitation event, but you all are here tonight, so obviously you care. So please ask me or some of my team about it. We have information downstairs, and we'll give you that. Join us across the way for more conversation and some refreshments. Thanks.